The U.S. war against Iran is officially coming to an end after more than 100 days of fighting. On the 15th of June, representatives of the U.S. and Iranian governments virtually signed a memorandum of understanding to end the war. This is not the final agreement. There will be a process of negotiation for 60 days, so the final deal can be expected in mid-August, but this is officially the end to the war. At least both sides are saying that this is the end of the war. Now, I'm recording this on the 17th of June, and as of today, neither party has released the text of the agreement. However, some media outlets have access to the Memorandum of Understanding, and in a moment here, I'm going to go through the most important details analyzing the agreement. But first, I want to briefly reflect on the political significance of this deal. It makes it as clear as day that the United States lost this war, a war of aggression that Trump himself launched on the 28th of February. The U.S. lost the war, and Iran is the victor. This is not just my opinion. This is now being openly acknowledged by mainstream Western media outlets, including the editorial board of the New York Times, which has supported every major U.S. war. Infamously, for instance, the New York Times printed the lies of the U.S. government in the lead up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And yet now, even this major newspaper has acknowledged the truth. Moreover, the New York Times published a very interesting op-ed acknowledging that this is going to have massive geopolitical reverberations, especially in the global south, because so many countries across the global south were supporting Iran as it was defending its sovereignty against U.S. imperialism. So this is a massive blow to U.S. imperialism. It's a significant victory for the global south more generally, and it demonstrates to the entire world the significant decline of U.S. hegemony. In a few minutes here, I'm going to come back to these articles and analyze different points they make. But first, like I said a moment ago, I'm going to look at the details of this agreement. And the Wall Street Journal has obtained access to the Memorandum of Understanding, and it notes that one of the most important aspects of this agreement is that the U.S. is now allowing Iran to sell its oil. That is to say, that the U.S. is lifting its sanctions on Iran's oil sector. And this is, of course, significant because Iran is one of the world's leading producers of oil. It's consistently among the top 10 largest oil-producing countries. And the U.S. war against Iran caused a massive energy crisis, the biggest oil supply disruption in history. This caused the global price of oil to skyrocket, which means the price of gasoline has also been rising in the United States and around the world. But especially in the U.S., this is a politically sensitive issue just a few months before midterm elections that are held in November. So this has led the U.S. government to release more and more oil from its SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. However, in the past few months, the SPR has reached a 43-year low. It has not been at such low levels since the 1980s. So when you consider all of that context, it makes sense why the U.S. government has agreed to lift the sanctions on Iran's oil sector. The U.S. is desperate to bring down the global price of oil, and by lifting sanctions, this will lead to an increase in the global supply of oil and hopefully bring down prices. So that's one of the most significant aspects of this deal that was signed between the U.S. and Iran. Now, like I said earlier, the exact text of this deal has not been publicly released as of the recording of this analysis today. However, the Saudi state media outlet Al Arabiya obtained a copy of the Memorandum of Understanding, and Al Arabiya published the different points that are addressed in the memo. So today I'm going to go through the most important details and provide more context. First of all, the most important aspect is that this deal announces an immediate and permanent end to the war on all fronts, including Israel's war in Lebanon, which the U.S. government was supporting. So the U.S. is now obligated to force Israel to stop waging this war. And if the U.S. actually uses its leverage, it can stop Israel immediately, because Israel cannot wage any of these wars without U.S. military assistance. And I'm not just talking about aid, I'm talking about arms sales. Israel does not have the capacity to produce all of the weapons, the different weapon systems, missile defense systems, and the ammunition that it uses in these wars. So if Trump actually tells Israel, we are not sending you any more missiles, any more ammo, Israel will have to stop the war. So if the U.S. abides by the agreement, and it's certainly very possible that the U.S. will not abide by this agreement. In fact, if you study U.S. history, you see the U.S. constantly violates the agreements that it signs. But we're in the first week of this agreement. So let's just look at the details and understand what the U.S. agreed to on paper. Another major point is that Iran and the U.S. will respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and not interfere in each other's internal affairs. This is a big deal that the U.S. is pledging to do this. Of course, if you study the history of U.S. foreign policy, you know that the U.S. is constantly interfering in the internal affairs of countries all around the world, so it would not surprise me in any way if Washington violated this aspect of the agreement. But on paper, the U.S. agreed to this. Now, another major detail that I mentioned is that this is not the final agreement. This is an initial memorandum of understanding, and it makes it clear that both sides will negotiate and reach a final agreement within a maximum period of 60 days. So they signed this on the 15th of June. It's likely we will see some kind of final agreement in mid-August, assuming it's not sabotaged, assuming the U.S. doesn't suddenly withdraw from the agreement and attack again, which is a possibility. But anyway, continuing with the deal, the U.S. agreed that it will lift its naval blockade of Iran and prevent any interference or obstruction against Iran. The U.S. also agreed to withdraw its military forces from surrounding areas within 30 days after the final agreement. So that will be likely in September. And on the other side, Iran agreed to open the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you followed this conflict for the past more than 100 days, you have definitely heard of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. government's Energy Information Administration has described this as the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Before the U.S. launched this war on the 28th of February, roughly 20% of the globally traded oil supply passed through this narrow strait on a daily basis, and it is right off the coast of Iran. So in response to the U.S. war of aggression, Tehran closed this strait, using its access to this geostrategic choke point as leverage to try to pressure the U.S. to end the war. So initially, the U.S. goal was regime change, to overthrow the Iranian government, to decapitate the leadership, and to put in power pro-Western puppets. That obviously failed. So instead, the U.S. moved the goalpost, and the new goal of the war was to open the Strait of Hormuz. But the Strait of Hormuz was already open before the U.S. launched the war. So the U.S. actually did not gain anything from this war. We're going back to the status quo ante, the way the situation was before. In fact, the deal signed between the U.S. and Iran says this quite clearly. It says they agree to maintain the status quo, and one of the most significant aspects is that the U.S. has agreed to lift sanctions on Iran and to not impose any new sanctions. So earlier, I already cited a report by the Wall Street Journal that makes it clear that the U.S. government has agreed to lift oil-related sanctions on Iran to increase the global supply of oil to bring down prices. However, according to the copy of the memo that was obtained by Saudi state media, Al Arabiya, that was only one part of the deal. Apparently, the U.S. government has also agreed to lift other sanctions on Iran, which, if true, is a massive victory for Tehran. This is what Iran has been demanding for many years. And I'm reading here from Al Arabiya. It says, the U.S. commits to ending all types of sanctions currently facing Iran, including unilateral U.S. sanctions and any UN-related sanctions. And as part of this, the U.S. apparently has agreed to create a comprehensive plan for the rehabilitation and economic development of Iran, ensuring financing of at least $300 billion. Now, this is a very big deal, and it's not just Al Arabiya reporting this. Reuters, the most mainstream of mainstream media outlets, also reported that the Iran deal includes a $300 billion reconstruction and investment fund, and more than half of that, more than $150 billion, have already been committed. I'm reading here from Reuters, quote, "A $300 billion private fund designed to trigger investment in Iran is outlined in the U.S.-Iran Framework Agreement, and more than half of that sum has already been committed," end quote. And then I'm continuing, quote, "The new fund is a private investment vehicle, not a reconstruction or reparations program, and will not include any government money or grants," the source said, adding that companies based in the U.S., Gulf Arab states, Asia, South America, and Africa have agreed to commit financing. Investments pledged span energy, logistics, manufacturing, and transport, end quote. So it's not reparations. It's not government money. These are $300 billion of investments by companies. And apparently it includes companies from all around the world, including U.S. companies. I'm a bit skeptical about that. I think many U.S. companies won't want to invest. However, Reuters reported that there are companies in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and the United States that have made commitments to invest in Iran. And that sounds pretty realistic. Like I said, I'm skeptical about U.S. companies investing because even if the U.S. agrees to lift sanctions temporarily, the U.S. may again impose sanctions on Iran in the near future. And then these companies could lose lots of their money that they invested. But I think it makes sense that there are companies across Asia that will want to invest in Iran. Another country not mentioned, the most important country in the global economy, is China. China already has invested a lot in Iran. And I think that the biggest outcome of this will be China will massively increase its investments in Iran because many Chinese companies have been afraid of secondary sanctions. So even though the U.S. has not directly sanctioned them, although recently the U.S. has sanctioned some Chinese companies for doing business with Iranian oil, but many other Chinese companies, I'm not just talking about the Chinese government and governmental institutions, I'm talking about Chinese companies, many of them have been afraid of investing in Iran because they don't want to be hit by secondary sanctions. And this is precisely why Reuters noted in this report, quote, "Iran, one of the Middle East's largest economies, has attracted almost no significant foreign direct investment in the past 4 decades, frozen out of global capital markets by successive waves of U.S. and international sanctions," end quote. Most of those sanctions were U.S. sanctions, not international. They often say that, but it's really U.S. unilateral sanctions. But these sanctions have done a lot of damage because the U.S. dominates the international financial system, which is based on the U.S. dollar. The U.S. has significant control over the SWIFT interbank messaging system, and many banks around the world, to communicate with each other for financial transactions, they use correspondent banks in the U.S., which has blocked many Iranian financial institutions from trading with companies and countries all around the world. So if the U.S. actually abides by its side of the agreement here and lifts sanctions on Iran, this is a very, very big deal and a major victory for Tehran. So going back to the details of this memo that was obtained by Al Arabiya, it notes that in addition to lifting sanctions on Iran, the U.S. has agreed to unfreeze the frozen and restricted funds and assets of Iran, which again is very significant because the U.S. has stolen billions of dollars of Iranian money. This is money that belongs to the people of Iran. And apparently the U.S. will now be allowing Iran to get access to that. This brings us to another controversial issue, which is the nuclear question. Apparently, according to this memo, Iran reiterated that it will never produce nuclear weapons, and the exact details of what will happen with Iran's enriched material will be addressed in the final agreement that will be negotiated in the subsequent 60 days, so by mid-August. And then finally, the memo ends stating that after the final agreement has been signed by both the US and Iran around mid-August, there will be a binding resolution in the UN Security Council, so it will be written into international law. Now, these last few points here about US sanctions relief, Iran agreeing to not pursue nuclear weapons, the question of international monitoring of Iran's enrichment, all of this might sound familiar if you remember what happened 11 years ago, because there was previously a major Iran nuclear deal that included most of these aspects that was signed back in 2015 by the US and Iran and the other permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that includes the UK, France, China, and Russia, along with the European Union and Germany. They all came together and they signed the Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and that was incorporated into international law with a UN Security Council resolution. However, Donald Trump hated that agreement, and back when he was campaigning to be president during the 2016 presidential election, he constantly attacked the deal, and then during his first term as US president in 2018, Trump officially withdrew the US unilaterally from the Iran nuclear deal. He claimed, quote, "The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into," end quote. Now, this was despite the fact that the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, said very clearly, a year after the US withdrew from the deal, the IAEA clarified that Iran had been abiding by the agreement. So the claim by Trump and his supporters that Iran violated the deal is a blatant lie. It is simply not true. It was the US that tore up the agreement that Iran was continuing to abide by. But now here we are 11 years later, and the Trump administration is on the verge of signing another deal with Iran that is very, very similar to the original deal that the Obama administration signed that Trump called the worst deal ever, except this deal is even more advantageous for Iran because in addition to including sanctions relief like the previous JCPOA included, this deal also includes this $300 billion investment fund to help Iran rebuild. That was not included in the previous deal that the Obama administration brokered. So that is just one example of why we can now conclusively say, without a doubt, that the US lost this war, Iran is the victor. And I think that's the perfect note to end on here, because we're talking about an absolutely historic development. Iran defeated the US empire. As even the New York Times editorial board admitted, this is a humiliating defeat for the US empire that will go down in the history books along with the humiliating defeat of the US empire in Vietnam. Of course, we still don't have the final agreement that will be negotiated in the upcoming 60 days, roughly. So it's certainly possible that all of this falls apart, and it's also quite possible that the US violates the agreement, even if it does sign a final agreement. The US has a long history of doing that. But the reality is that we can now see that the US does not really have much leverage over Iran. It is Tehran that has demonstrated that it has much more leverage. And that is what is the serious geopolitical lesson of all of this. That is what is so deeply significant. Of course, in the upcoming months, we will continue reporting on this issue. So make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you follow our work here at Geopolitical Economy Report. We have constant analysis to help people understand what's going on in the global economy and in global politics. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.